We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. In this lesson, we study how God's people survived their captivity in Persia. After Babylon was conquered by the Persians, the Jews were released from captivity by King Cyrus of Persia to return to their homeland. However, some of the Jews decided to remain in Persia. Among them were close relatives Mordecai and Esther. Vashti, the queen, was banished by King Ahasuerus because of her perceived disobedience. The king held what we might call a beauty contest among the fairest young virgins so that he could choose another wife. Esther was among those young women, but no one knew that she was a Jew. Hegai, the king's chamberlain, presented her before the king, who liked her beauty and charm, and made her his queen. At some point in time, because Mordecai saved the king's life, he also found favor with the king. When Haman, the king's right-hand man, was promoted by the king, all the king's princes and those at his court bowed down to Haman, except for Mordecai. This angered Haman, prompting him to devise a plan to get the king to destroy Mordecai and all the Jews in the kingdom. Unaware of what people Haman wanted killed, King Ahasuerus agreed to Haman's request and a date was set for their destruction. When Mordecai heard about Haman's scheme, he convinced Esther to act on behalf of her people and save them while risking her own life. Esther sent Mordecai back a message agreeing to go before the king on behalf of her fellow Jews. Esther got an appointment with the king, and she prepared a feast for him and Haman. Esther wanted to reveal Haman's plan to destroy her and her people. Meanwhile, Haman, influenced by his wife and his friends, had a gallows to hang Mordecai on. That night, unable to sleep, the king asked that the book of records be read to him. They found a portion that said Mordecai saved King Ahasuerus from being overthrown, causing the king to ask if anything had been done for Mordecai, and they said that nothing had been done for him. Seeing Haman in the courtyard, the king asked him what should be done for somebody who has performed a great deed. Haman thought the king was talking about him, so he advised the king to give that person the royal treatment. When the king told Haman that the one who had found favor with him was Mordecai, Haman did as he advised the king, but he returned home depressed. Haman's friends and wife said to him in Esther 4:13, "If Mordecai is a Jew, you cannot win. You have already started to fall. Surely you will be ruined." We can see God throughout this story. Without doubt he was orchestrating it all. Our lesson begins with chapter 7. Verse 1 says, "So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet." The banquet here was the second dinner that Esther prepared for King Ahasuerus and Haman. She invited them so she would tell the king what her request was. Verse 2 says, "And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, 'Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted.'" King Ahasuerus was extremely curious about what Esther's request would be, for he again asked, "What is your petition?" We are not told why it was so important for the king to know what Esther would ask for, but he longed to know about it to the extent of offering her half of the kingdom of Persia. He was so enamored with her that he may have been exaggerating just to impress her. Verse 3 says, "Then Queen Esther answered, 'If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life, this is my petition. And spare my people, this is my request.'" Time was running out for Esther and her people, for it had been about 2 months since Haman convinced the king to issue a decree, declaring that the Jews should be exterminated. That means in less than 9 months, the king's order would go into effect. So with the opportunity, Esther, the queen, demonstrating humility, first pleaded for her own life, for the life of the queen was at stake. Second, she pleaded for her people, a whole nation and a nation dear to her. She was interceding for her people. Verse 4 says, "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. Esther considered the king's decree to exterminate her and her people the same as being sold, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. At this time the king didn't know who the person or persons were who wanted Esther and her Jewish people destroyed. Esther said that she wouldn't complain to the king if they had been sold into slavery because as slaves, there was always hope that Jehovah would deliver his people, as he did from Egyptian bondage, and the Babylonian captivity. But there was no hope in death. Verse 5 says, King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Upon hearing Esther's request, the king wanted to know who was it and where is he whose heart was filled with so much hate as to plan the murder of the queen and all her people. King Ahasuerus couldn't believe that anyone had the nerve to do such a thing without his permission. But he did give permission, when he signed the order in response to Haman's request. For some reason the king never thought to ask who the people were that would be destroyed. He may have simply assumed that there was a nation of people in his empire who didn't keep his laws. That would be all the king needed to hear, and there would be no need to know who those people were. Besides, since Haman was the king's right-hand man so to speak, King Ahasuerus trusted him. Verse 6 says, Esther said, "An adversary and enemy. This vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Without any hesitation, and maybe even pointing her finger at him, Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." Esther told the king that Haman was the one who designed the murder of her and her people, and to make things worse, Haman had drawn the king in, to be a partaker of his crime, as he ignorantly agreed to it by signing the decree. As soon as Esther pointed the finger at Haman, he was afraid before the king and the queen. For sure, it was time for Haman to be afraid when the queen was his prosecutor, the king was his judge, and his own conscience was a witness against him. Verse 7 says, the king got up in a rage, left his wine and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. No doubt being furious at hearing the queen identify Haman as the guilty party, the king leaves the banquet in his anger. He went to the palace garden to cool off and to consider what needed to be done. When Haman saw the king angrily get up and leave the table, he stayed behind to request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Wicked Haman now becomes a humble petitioner to the queen for his life. How shameful Haman looks when he stands up first and then falls down at Esther's feet to beg her to save his life. Verse 8 says, just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Once the king had calmed down, he returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, and lo and behold, he saw Haman no longer standing before the queen, but now laying at Esther's feet. When the king saw Haman on the couch with Queen Esther, no doubt all kinds of thoughts ran through his mind. Since Haman wanted to take the queen's life, the king would not be wrong to suspect that he wanted to take her chastity as well. Just as soon as the king uttered the words, "Will he force the queen also before me in the house?" his officials or servants covered Haman's face, as a condemned man, not worthy any more to see the king or be seen by him. It was practice to cover the face of the one who was condemned to death because the Persian kings refused to look at them. They marked him for execution. Those who are hanged commonly have their faces covered. Verse 9 says, then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house." He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, "Impale him on it." Harbonah, the chamberlain, probably saw the gallows or the fixtures used for hanging that Haman built for Mordecai. He told the king that it was 50 cubits high or 75 feet. Mordecai, whose death Haman plotted, is now better known, for the chamberlain speaks well of him when he said, "Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." Mordecai learned of a plot to kill the king and told it to Queen Esther, and the king's life was saved. The king then gave orders that Haman was to be hanged on his own gallows, which was done accordingly. The king's sentence was short: hang him there. Verse 10 says, so they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. The execution was speedy, for we are told that they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. According to Esther 8:1, the execution took place immediately that same day. After they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, our text says then was the king's wrath pacified. This means that the king's anger subsided. Key verse. They impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Esther 7:10. The pole Haman built to kill Mordecai became the means by which his own life is taken. Haman's prejudice and hatred are what led to his destruction. Justice was fully exacted in kind for the injustice that Haman intended upon the innocent man and his people. Mordecai is now given the position of honor, and Haman the execution. After this the king's anger vanished. Thought to remember. Act justly in every situation. God is not interested in sacrifices or religious acts that have no meaning behind them. We need to pay attention to what God emphasized. Throughout the Bible, over and over, the Hebrew people, and later Christ followers, are called to act justly. End oppression. Take care of the poor. Treat foreigners in your land, the same as your own people. Widows and orphans, who have no way of providing for themselves, need your help. This is the way God treats us and the way He expects us to treat others. Our lesson next week is entitled, A Justice-Loving God. Our biblical reference is Isaiah 61:8-11. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this week's lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. We wish you can join us at the Cubao Church of Christ soon. Our congregation is a place to discover faith, find new friends, grow closer relationship with Christ and serve with each other's gifts. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.